Where I am, there's snow on the ground, lights on the houses, and the mailboxes are filled with cards and letters. And I'm filming this episode of Taking Up Space on December 21st, the 52nd anniversary of the launch of Apollo 8 on humankind's very first mission to the moon. One that would place the crew of Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders in lunar orbit on Christmas Eve of 1968. In this installment, we'll explore a bit of context around the Apollo 8 mission using one such Christmas letter as our highlighted artifact to tell the story. For sure, it's a space-age Christmas letter unlike any you've ever seen before. Are you ready to take a look? Well, away we go. Season's greetings, collectors and space fans. I'm Jim Frangione, and welcome back to another installment of Taking Up Space, the place where space history lives and where every artifact tells a story, where we seek to preserve vintage artifacts, reveal their history, and hopefully inspire some of you in the next generation of space explorers to take on interest in studies relating to STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math. If you're as passionate as I am about spaceflight or the preservation of space-age history, be sure to click on the subscribe button and notification bell down below so that you don't miss out on a single episode. 52 years ago this week, the crew of Apollo 8 headed for the moon on what is arguably one of the boldest, most daring, and consequential spaceflight missions to date, by the United States or by any other spacefaring nation for that matter. As Jim Lovell once put it, the story of Apollo 8 was so incredibly fantastic that it was even beyond what the Hollywood screenwriters of the time could have dreamt up. Hands down, it was NASA's boldest decision ever. After only one flight of its newly designed command and service modules, they would be mounted atop the giant Saturn V rocket for the very first manned flight, a flight all the way to the moon and back. The setting for the Apollo 8 story had it all. There was international intrigue. This flight profile of flying into lunar orbit without a lunar lander came about due to CIA intelligence that the Soviet Union was preparing a manned flight around the moon. If the Soviets flew around the moon first, they could legitimately claim to have beaten the US again by sending the first humans to the moon, and the space race would, for all intents and purposes, essentially be lost for the Americans. On the home front, this was not the news America needed in 1968. You see, 1968 was a lot like 2020, in that it seemed like it was a year full of nothing but bad news. We were embroiled in a very unpopular war that was raging in Vietnam. There was civil unrest in our streets, and our politics were marked by a divisiveness punctuated by the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. With that as a backdrop, Apollo 8 was going to bring good news to America by year's end. Not only would it fly, it would beat the Russians to the moon, and it would do so on Christmas Eve in full view of the world. Which takes us to our artifact for this episode. It is this postal cover, signed by Apollo 8 astronaut Bill Anders. For those who may not know, he was the astronaut responsible for taking one of the most iconic photographs in human history, Apollo 8's photo of Earth from the moon, known as Earthrise. We typically see this photo in landscape format, but the photo's proper orientation is actually in the portrait orientation. Now, this signed postal cover is neat in and of itself. It's postmarked on the day of the launch, has a bright red Apollo 8 cachet artwork on it, and it bears a bold Bill Anders signature at the bottom. But the story this postal cover carries with it makes it absolutely fascinating. For inside the envelope is contained a family Christmas letter, the 1968 family Christmas letter of astronaut Bill Anders himself. The opening paragraph explains its significance. Dear friends, this letter was mailed to you on the day of the Apollo 8 launch from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and is our way to convey to you our good wishes for a happy and holy holiday season. I hope that while you are reading this, the spacecraft and its crew will be orbiting the moon and sending you and the rest of the world a Christmas greeting via unified S-band and TV. Incredibly cool, right? This is how the Anders family chose to mark the occasion and to share their story of their year with their friends and family. Just imagine what it was like in 1968 to receive this letter knowing that the sender was orbiting the moon on humankind's very first journey there. The narrative revealed by this artifact staggers the imagination even today. In 1968, it had to seem utterly surreal. In some ways it's ordinary, in other ways it's completely out of this world. Like the most human of holiday letters, it goes on to detail the family's many events throughout the year. Water skiing, visits with family, Val Anders' ballet lessons and participation in the church choir, Boy Scout and Cub Scout accomplishments, visits to the zoo and to the beach, and of course, details of the rigorous training schedule of the head of the household, including training in the lunar landing research vehicle, which, as Mrs. Anders notes, crashed after Neil Armstrong was forced to eject during a simulated landing. It begs the question if the Armstrong family got one of these letters and how Neil must have felt being called out. The letter closes with an expression of the family's pride in being a part of the Apollo effort and an ask to join the family in their prayers for Bill, Frank, and Jim, and for the success of the Apollo 8 mission. Sincerely, Valerie and the Anders family. Wow, there's an awful lot to be unpacked upon close examination of this postal cover and its letter. For me, looking at it truly underscores the human aspect of this spaceflight in a way that few other objects can. For all of the scientific, technological, and engineering accomplishments that made this endeavor possible, at the end of the day, it was still three very human men contained in that little bubble of air as it circled the moon. Bill, Frank, and Jim. Husbands, fathers, friends, folks from Houston, Texas, with families who, like many others, send Christmas cards and holiday letters. Ordinary people who, in 1968, were a part of something that was absolutely extraordinary. Now, as if this story needed an exclamation point, remember that Christmas greeting from lunar orbit that was alluded to in the letter? Well, the Apollo 8 astronauts delivered a greeting to the world that, for those who lived it, is still remembered for the unity and the hushed sense of wonder it imparted upon the largest listening audience in human history at the time. On Christmas Eve, 1968, having traveled all the way to the moon to discover none other than Mother Earth, they read from the book of Genesis. Let's listen in.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness.
And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day.
God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Incredible, isn't it? Personally, I think so. But not all were so taken by it. NASA was actually sued by an atheist leader of the time, Madalyn Murray O'Hair, alleging First Amendment violations pertaining to the separation of church and state. The case was ultimately dismissed, and the Supreme Court declined to hear an appeal. Others saw it very differently. One anonymous telegram to Bill Anders thanking him said, "You saved 1968." The vast majority of people were in the latter camp. They welcomed it and saw it for what it was. Three all-too-human men of faith on mankind's greatest journey ever at a seminal moment in human history. And it is still widely regarded as such for the broader message it conveyed at a very tumultuous time in our history. A message of hope, of peace, and of goodwill towards one another. It was exactly what the world needed at the time. The crew of Apollo 8 would successfully return to Earth on December 27th and would go on to grace the cover of Time magazine in January as 1968's Men of the Year. Jim Lovell would, of course, later go on to command the death-defying mission of Apollo 13 in April of 1970, and Bill Anders and Frank Borman, they would never fly in space again. But Apollo 8's Earthrise photo, taken by Bill Anders, would go on to become iconic. It would go on to grace postage stamps, and it would even make the case for and be credited with the launching of the environmental movement to protect our fragile planet and to preserve our species. Not a bad legacy for a photo, or for Bill Anders for that matter. And that's a wrap for today, folks. In fact, that's a wrap for 2020. I hope you've enjoyed seeing this rare Apollo 8 artifact and that its narrative added a bit of color to your understanding of the more human aspect to what was arguably one of humankind's greatest accomplishments. You know, a lot like 1968, 2020 has shown us our own share of tumult in terms of divisiveness, human suffering, and violence. But as demonstrated by the crew of Apollo 8 at the end of 1968, there was still hope for better things to come. And there is equally hope for us as we head into 2021. As we approach these holidays, may the best of that hope be with you and yours during this season, and may our collective 2021 be filled with a sense of peace, well-being, and goodwill towards one another. If Apollo teaches us anything, it's to banish the word impossible. Again, thanks a million for tuning into this channel. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give it a thumbs up down below, and feel free to let me know your thoughts by dropping me an email at jim.takinupspace@gmail.com. Until 2021, collectors and space fans, keep your heads held high and keep your eyes on the stars.
3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good.